sort of leak, and it has been very high throughout this entire century, hence making the study of the color line very important. This also holds for another crucial dimension, which is housing. Yeah? Let's start here on the right-hand side, where you see a depiction of the home ownership rate in the United States by white and black households. So how many households own the housing units that they occupy? And you see that historically, here in 1870, there was a gap of 49 percentage points, right, between white and black households in owning their own homes. A gap that was then reduced to only 26%. But it's again interesting to note that this gap did not close very much across the 20th century, despite common increases in home ownership rates, particularly after the Second World War. So a difference of home ownership rates between immigrant populations, ethnic groups, and say the dominant populations in countries is very widespread, but the persistence of the home ownership rate gap of white and black households in the United States is particularly striking. This also translates then in the gap, white-black wealth gap. Yeah? So housing is the most important component in household wealth for almost all households, with exception of the very rich households. So yeah, if you don't own a home, obviously you don't have any wealth, which is why, yeah, the home ownership, the wealth gap of white to black households here was up to a factor of almost 60. So white households at a time when slavery was not abolished was 60 times as much as the household wealth of black households, which after the abolition then fell, obviously, but as you can see here, was also quite persistently scoring about a factor of 6. So up to the current day then, the wealth gap between white and black households is up to a factor of 6. So urban segregation, also wealth, still highly unequally distributed, and this not only at the time of writing of Du Bois, but the color line is persistent across an entire century. Yeah, another figure that shows this are mortality rates, which went down across the century with the hygiene revolution, the rise of a modern health system, United States obviously being an exception here, of a country that has still many uninsured and not a mandatory health insurance. But as you can see here, despite this common trend of falling mortality rates, it's still a fact that particularly here black males have higher mortality rates here as measured by 100,000 population when compared to the white population. Just another trend, mortality rate also translate into life expectancy, which is lowest again here for the black population and has been ever since. So there's a gap of life expectancy that has narrowed but has not vanished. And yet another important domain where the color line has been important throughout is education. Here the share of the over 25-year-olds with a bachelor degree, with again black and the Hispanic population here scoring the lowest percentages. So all of this is to motivate Webb Du Bois' major point that the study of the color line within American society, as we will see still in this lecture, and also in a post-colonial context, as we will see in a future lecture, is important, has been important, not only then, but also now. Yeah. So let's turn a little bit to Webb Du Bois' writing. So one of the key terms that he uses in the Souls book to study the race problem, of what he calls the race problem, is the term double consciousness. Yeah? Here with one of the two actually only mentions of the term in Soul. Quote, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two wearing ideals in one dark body, whose dark strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost," unquote. So what double consciousness refers to is a contradictory self-perception of the Black population, because on the one hand, they just perceive themselves simply as Black people. On the other hand, they see themselves through the eyes of a discriminating white population whose discriminating stances and implicit assumptions about superiority they even copy by viewing themselves through their eyes. Yeah? And this notion of double consciousness has produced a lot of writings about how to understand it, in particular because Du Bois mentioned it only twice in this book and then stops actually using it. But one interpretation which I find quite sensible is that it refers back actually to the Hegelian concept of unhappy consciousness that also re-emerged in the Frankfurt School as false consciousness. The idea being that the Black population of the time had been living basically with a false consciousness of inferiority by adopting the view of the white population. This concept goes back even to Rousseau and his idea of self-estrangement, where basically the economic conditions, the societal conditions of the time lead the Black population to have a self-perception that has intrinsic contradictions, and that produces a consciousness which is not at one, which is basically in Hegel's terms, which is unhappy. So Du Bois was exposed to Hegel in the 1890s, and it is an hypothesis that it was a term also adopted from this idealist kind of thinking, but again turned upside down because it is obviously societal conditions which have produced this double consciousness. The second important contribution that Du Bois has made to the study of the race problem is to introduce the social constructivist notion of race against the predominant biological determinist notion. Yeah? So let's see his quote here. "What then is race? It is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life." End of quote. So what Du Bois argues then is that race is not something that is predetermined by, let's say, biological characteristics at a time when DNA was not even discovered. Um, so people were thinking about race in terms of blood composition, body composition. There was a strange discipline of craniology that tried to observe sort of skull characteristics in order to predict also social behaviors. So Du Bois argues against this kind of tradition and says that sort of the racial differences that we observe, they have a history. They can be studied also in their historical construction. They are basically not reducible to any kind of underlying biology that would be studied through natural sciences. In his definition, then, of being black, he does include also 3 physical and so-called 8 spiritual groups. Yeah? And it has been a discussion to what extent these physical groups that he still identifies, or this term blood here also in this definition, are still a legacy of biological thought of his time. But it is clear that in Du Bois' definition, the weight is also on these, what he calls the spiritual races. So if you want, the historically constructed elements of racial groups. He identifies these 8 different types, which has also been criticized for giving us unclear criteria of what it is. Du Bois wrote at a time when this psychology of ethnic groups was still a potential discipline, something that is also not considered scientific anymore nowadays. Another issue that is still discussed is to what extent Du Bois thinks of the term race as a nominal or a realist definition.